Just a few days ago now, AMD released the highly anticipated Ryzen 7 9800X 3D. And I think it's fair to say virtually everyone was excited by what this thing had to offer. Prior to the release, it was pretty difficult to gauge where the 9800X 3D would land, especially relative to something like a 7800X 3D. And while I was personally hoping for at least a 10% uplift on average, I never expected to see gaming gains exceed 20% in individual cases, so that was really nice to see. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by MSI and their GeForce RTX 40 series graphics cards, including the brand new Stalker 2 Edition RTX 4070 Ti Super. This special edition model is based on MSI's gaming slim design, meaning it occupies just 2 expansion slots and comes with upgraded Torx 5.0 fans and Trifroza 3 cooling. As this is the Stalker 2 edition, it comes with a stunning theme design, complete with a custom shroud that's ready for the exclusion zone, as well as an included game redemption. NVIDIA's Ada Lovelace GPUs are the best way to enjoy ray tracing with improved, more realistic visuals and lighting in the latest and greatest games like Stalker 2, Black Myth Wukong, Alan Wake 2 and Cyberpunk 2077. Plus, there's support for AI-powered DLSS 3 frame generation and reflex, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. What I want to know now is, how does the 9800X 3D compare to the 7800X 3D across a massive range of games? So to find out, we're testing them head-to-head in 45 titles. And for this one, we are going to format things a bit differently to how we have in the past. Rather than just show you the individual results for around a dozen of the games tested, and then a single graph which shows the margins across the rest of the results, I'm going to show you the results for 5 games at a time. That way you can see the FPS data for every single game tested. Also, as usual, all CPU gaming benchmarks will be conducted at 1080p using the GeForce RTX 4090. And if you believe yourself to be a PC enthusiast, but don't understand why reviewers test this way, don't take to the comments section to vent your frustration. Rather, please check out the videos linked in the description, which explain the very basics of CPU benchmarking and why things are done the way they are. Okay, let's get into the graphs. Our first set of results include 5 games, and we'll start with The Last of Us Part 1, where the 9800X 3D was on average 20% faster, which is a huge win, but it also improved the 1% lows by a massive 33%. Then we have Cyberpunk, where we saw a more modest 8% increase to the average frame rate, and then Hogwarts Legacy, where the results were much more impressive, up to 21% greater performance here from the new Zen 5 3D V-Cache model. The 7800X 3D was already mighty fast in ACC, but even so, the 9800X 3D was still able to provide an additional 14% performance, hitting 269 FPS. Then we have Spider-Man Remastered, where the 9800X 3D was 15% faster, rendering comfortably over 200 FPS on average, and we also saw a massive 22% increase to the 1% lows, so overall much better performance in this title. In this next batch of games, we're seeing pretty consistent gains across the board. Testing with Baldur's Gate 3 saw the 9800X 3D delivering 11% more performance on average, with an 18% improvement to the 1% lows. We're also looking at a nice 16% boost to the averages in Homeworld 3, and a much needed 21% uplift for the 1% lows. The 9800X 3D pushes ever closer to 200 FPS in A Plague Tale Requiem, rendering 195 FPS, making it 10% faster. Interestingly, there's almost no improvement to the 1% lows in Microsoft Flight Simulator, yet the average frame rate was increased by 17%, rendering 95 FPS. Then we have Starfield, where the 7800X 3D was only able to throughput 116 FPS in our test, which is a surprisingly low frame rate, and clearly the game is heavily CPU limited. That being the case, the 9800X 3D was able to offer strong gains with an average of 140 FPS, which is a 21% increase. Moving on, we have Horizon Forbidden West, and despite testing quite a CPU-demanding village section of the game, these X3D processors delivered similar results, as the new Zen 5 model was just 5% faster. It was a similar story in Horizon Zero Dawn, where the 9800X 3D was just 3% faster. Now, a game where we do see big gains for the 9800X 3D is Watch Dogs Legion. Here the average frame rate increased by 14%, which is impressive, but it's the 1% lows that are most impressive, improving by a massive 36%. The gains in Far Cry 6 are much smaller. Here we're looking at just a 5% improvement, so about the bare minimum that you'd hope for. And the same applies to Thrones and Liberty. Here the 9800X 3D is a mere 6% faster. For the next set of results, we'll start with Hitman 3, where the 9800X 3D is delivering an additional 8% performance, allowing for 289 FPS. The Callisto Protocol, on the other hand, appears GPU limited, despite only delivering just shy of 150 FPS at 1080p using an RTX 4090. Now, we are seeing a 10% boost in Shadow of the Tomb Raider, jumping up from 328 FPS to 361 FPS. And the gains in Halo Infinite, along with Warhammer 3, are extremely small. We're looking at just a 2 to 3% margin in those examples. Next up, we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6, and despite using the basic quality preset, which allows for well over 300 FPS, both the 7800X 3D and 9800X 3D delivered virtually the same performance, with no more than 1% separating these results. The gains in Borderlands 3 were also disappointing. Here the new Zen 5 version is just 3% faster. The Riftbreaker CPU benchmark is very CPU demanding, and as a result, the 9800X 3D is able to outperform the 7800X 3D by a 12% margin in this example. The Remnant 2 is also a very CPU demanding title. Here we're looking at a 14% performance increase, though the 1% lows remained much the same. Then we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and in this example, the 9800X 3D also does quite well, delivering a 9% performance improvement. Moving on to War Thunder, the 9800X 3D is 9% faster here, hitting 397 FPS, and we're even seeing a 14% boost to the 1% lows. Unfortunately though, performance goes unchanged in Skull and Bones, Returnal, and Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, and in some instances this will be because we're GPU limited, but that's not always going to be the case. It could also just happen to be that the 9800X 3D isn't always going to be much faster or faster than the 7800X 3D. That said, we did find a 13% performance uplift in Dying Light 2, which is a noteworthy gain. I've included the Forza games because they're always heavily requested, but truth be told, they're not very CPU demanding, certainly not when talking about top tier CPUs, with only a very slight edge favouring the Zen 5 model. Where the 9800X 3D is able to pull ahead is in the Gears 5 benchmark, where it was able to boost the average frame rate by 10% and the 1% lows by 23%. So a good uplift there, and we see a similar thing in Ghost of Tsushima, where the 9800X 3D was 13% faster on average. Unfortunately though, there's no additional performance to be had in Hunt Showdown 1896, at least where we're testing. Okay, here we have the second last set of results, and we'll start with World War Z, where the 9800X 3D is 10% faster, or 15% faster if we look at the 1% lows. Then we have F1, which isn't a good CPU benchmark, but again, some of you play it, and you'll want to see the results, so here they are. Smoking fast performance all round then. And speaking of smoking fast performance, how does 675 FPS sound in Rainbow Six Siege? Probably enough, even for the esports guys. The 9800X 3D was only 4% faster here, but the 7800X 3D was probably fast enough to begin with. On the other hand, Counter-Strike 2 sees a much-needed 13% performance injection, taking the FPS to 668, which CS2 players will tell you is almost enough FPS. Then there's my favourite Fortnite, and here the 9800X 3D is 8% faster. So it looks like I'll be upgrading my gaming PC shortly. Finally, we have the last 5 games tested, bringing the grand total to 45 games. The Assassin's Creed games can be very CPU demanding at times, but not to the degree that you'll see any real separation between very high-end gaming CPUs such as the 7800X 3D and 9800X 3D. Space Marine 2, on the other hand, is extremely CPU limited, so the 9800X 3D comes in clutch here, boosting frame rates by 10% for a more genuine high refresh rate experience. Sadly, however, Star Wars Outlaws, which is another very CPU limited game, sees no improvement with the 9800X 3D. Then we have the new Dragon Age, the Veilguard game, and here the 9800X 3D is 10% faster, or a massive 19% faster when comparing 1% lows, so that's a great result. Okay, so here's how the 9800X3D and 7800X3D compare head-to-head across the 45 games tested. And on average, the Zen 5 part was 8% faster, which is what AMD officially claimed for this part, though we found an 11% margin in our day one review, which focused more on CPU demanding titles such as Starfield, Hogwarts Legacy, The Last of Us Part 1, Homeworld 3, and Watch Dogs Legion, just to name a few. We're also seeing big margins in Microsoft Flight Simulator and Spider-Man Remastered, for example, but then we're also seeing next to no performance uplift for 19 of the 45 games tested, and in those examples the margin is 5% or less. And in some of those examples, the 9800X3D just isn't much faster than the 7800X3D, but I'd say in most of them the reason is either we're finding the GPU limits, or the game just requires very little CPU power, such as the Forza games, for example. So if we remove 15 of those titles, we get back to an 11% margin, and this in my opinion better represents the gaming performance between the 7800X3D and 9800X3D. In the sense that future, more demanding titles will almost certainly see margins like what we're seeing today in games like Hogwarts Legacy and Starfield. So there you have it. As we found in our day one review, the 9800X3D is up to 21% faster than the 7800X3D, which is an incredible performance uplift given what we found previously with the non-3D Vcache Zen 4 versus Zen 5 testing. Then, depending on the sample of games used for testing and how those games are tested, the average performance gain can be anywhere from around 5% all the way up to 15%. I think the 11% margin shown in our day one review is a better representation of the performance margin between these two CPUs. And as I said, I fully expect that in a year or two from now, margins of at least 11% will become the norm as games continue to become increasingly CPU demanding. Now, in terms of value, it's going to be a while before the 9800X3D is able to offer what the 7800X3D did at $340 US. But if you're after the best possible gaming experience, then the 9800X3D at the $480 US MSRP is a no-brainer. Next up, I plan to run the Intel Core i9 14900K and then probably the Core Ultra 9 285K through the same 45 game benchmark, and hopefully I'll have one of those matchups ready for you next week. Until then, I hope you enjoyed all of this testing. Make sure you're subscribed for those upcoming comparisons. And if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed member, we have the join button, or you can go to the video description and sign up to our Patreon account. And either one of those will give you access to our exclusive Discord server. You can get access to monthly live streams. There's Q&A stuff there, behind the scenes content, a lot of cool things. So check that out if you're interested. But if not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.